They handed you a halberd, not because you'd need it necessarily, but because it came with the job, and because it looked excellent when propped up dramatically next to a lantern. The year is 1667. The sun dips below the stone-lined rooftops of a flickering candlelit city. The baker's wife has shouted her last insult across the alley. The last eel pie has been sold. You, dear night watchman, are just reporting for duty. Of course, you don't know what you're doing. You're wearing someone else's coat, which smells like boiled mutton and fear. The lantern in your hand sputters like it's trying to retire early. And that halberd, it's heavier than optimism before coffee. Your job is to patrol the streets of a city that doesn't want to be patrolled. Everyone's already appropriately terrified at the idea of crime, given that even stealing a handkerchief can earn you a date with the gallows. But still, the townsfolk sleep poorly, because fires are common. Crime is petty but persistent, and rats have formed what seems like a minor government in the grain silos. Your shift begins at sunset, not metaphorically, but in the very literal, medieval sun dips, marigum go kind of way. No clocks, just you awkwardly squinting at the horizon and saying, "That looks like most of the sun is gone," while buckling your belt and mumbling something about honor. You begin your round trudging past timber frame buildings that lean toward each other like gossiping aunts. The cobblestones are wet, as they always are, covered in a thin layer of mysterious substance, not yet fully explained by science or God. The occasional lantern glows weakly behind shuttered windows. Someone coughs. You swing your halberd theatrically and shout the traditional greeting, "All's well." You say that every quarter hour, like a town crier who's only learned one line, which makes sense because your other duty aside from yelling "All's well" is, well, that's most of it really. But you also must check that fires aren't starting themselves in a thatched roof somewhere, that suspicious figures aren't loitering, and that overly amorous apprentices aren't sneaking out, because heaven forbid love strikes after curfew. Speaking of curfew, the entire concept comes from the French couvre-feu, cover fire, since townsfolk were supposed to extinguish their hearths at night to prevent the entire city from going up like a festive but highly flammable biscuit factory. And aren't you grateful for that bit of history while you're pacing down Fishmonger's Alley, where something definitely just moved? Could have been a cat, could have been a ghost, or a cat ghost. Whatever it was, you make a noble attempt to appear unfazed, despite the fact that your lantern is throwing ominous shadows and your halberd is definitely not designed for cat-ghost combat. You stop outside the baker's shop and knock 3 times with your stick, not because the baker asked you to, but because knocking on things makes you look busy. As with many professions, being seen to be doing something is half the battle. Uniform-wise, you're wearing a slightly belted tunic, thick woolen stockings, some questionable shoes, and a wide-brimmed hat big enough to make shade fashionably irrelevant. The outfit is designed either to intimidate would-be criminals or to make you look like you're about to start an interpretive dance about crop rotation. Time passes slowly when your job is mostly walking in circles and inventing new ways to say, "It's still quite dark." Around midnight, you detour into the churchyard, not because you're a thrill seeker, but because it's unwise to skip a scheduled visit. The church warden once wrote a formal complaint when the watch skipped his gate during patrol. His letter, by the way, was inscribed in nearly illegible Latin and sealed with enough red wax to preserve a goose. While standing among the mossy gravestones, you hear it, a clinking noise. Could be nothing. Could be someone distilling moonshine. Could be someone trying to resuscitate ye old black market. You tap your halberd meaningfully on the ground, All's well, you declare, mostly to the ghosts and your own increasingly skeptical toes. You haven't had a proper meal since midday. Night watchmen often make do with porridge, again. Usually cold, sometimes not entirely grain. No one really knows what's in those bowls, but the optimism of oats is long gone by the night shift. Still, your lantern casts a calming glow on the cobbles. Somewhere, a baby sighs in sleep. Someone coughs in a manner that suggests they may require a doctor in the next 5 to 7 years. And you, dear watchman, continue onward. If these stories help you drift off, please subscribe to the channel. It would mean the world to me. And before you fully fade into dreamland, I would love to know where you're listening from and what time it is there. And so, the night deepens. The streets of a 17th century European city didn't exactly sparkle after sundown. There were no gas lamps with warm flickers, no buzzing neon signs, no enlightened sidewalks patrolled by friendly bobbies. No, after dusk, the cobblestones belonged to the unmentionables, drunken journeymen, alleyway sketch artists, mostly cats, and an overwhelming stench that might best be described as communal ouch. Into this ode to darkness waddled our reluctant hero, the night watchman. He did not stride out with the smug confidence of a Netflix crime drama protagonist. No cape, no grappling hook. Just a lantern that flickered nervously like it too had second thoughts about this line of work. Now, before you picture a polished guard in crisp uniform, please recalibrate. The average 17th century night watchman was typically a middle-aged man who'd either ticked off the local magistrate or desperately needed the 3 pence paid per night. Qualifications: questionable eyesight, an ability to shout in fog, and a constitution strong enough to pass within 10 paces of the city latrines without fainting. Armed with a staff, a poorly fitting cloak, and in some cities, a bladder made of pig's intestine that served as a primitive whistle. Yes, you heard that right. It was his solemn duty to patrol the sleeping city. Who goes there? He would bellow at anything that moved. The problem: in most cities, what moved at night wasn't people. It was rats, dogs, or, on one genus-confounding occasion in Strasbourg, a goose trained to steal shoes. There was also shouting. So much shouting. The watchman would announce the hour as he patrolled, chanting in an oddly poetic drone, 10 of the clock and all is well, which frankly was very optimistic. All was never well. There might be a fire smouldering near the bakery, an escaped lunatic sermonizing from a rooftop, or 2 gentlemen accusing each other of witchcraft because one of them beat the other in a game of dice with suspicious frequency. But all is well had a calming rhythm, and besides, who's going to argue with a man holding a pig blatter whistle and trying his best? His lantern, hooked on a stick to extend its dim reach, gently illuminated the street's more disturbing realities. Refuse that hadn't been collected since before Lent, strange stains that defied explanation, and windows faintly glowing with the trembling candlelight of insomnia. Sometimes he would pause, peer suspiciously at a sleeping dog, and then declare it a public hazard for looking too confident. And then there was the matter of crime. The night watchman's role was technically to deter it, but in reality, his most potent weapon was embarrassment. Upon encountering 2 suspicious figures lugging a barrel through the alley, he might raise his staff, squint heavily, and yell, "Stop in the name of, well, whoever's name we're using this week." More often than not, the figures would run, and the watchman would chase them approximately 4 paces before forgetting what he was doing. And let's not forget weather. Night air in 17th century cities had 3 moods: freezing fog that iced one's moustache into vaguely ecclesiastical shapes, pouring rain that turned every footstep into a sloshy regret, or an inexplicable summer miasma thick with the smells of fish, sweat, and regret. Rarely, if ever, was it comfortable. By early morning, if he made it through the night without being insulted, pelted with turnips, or accidentally joining a group of radical pamphleteers, he would retire to a small lodge by the city gate. He'd sit down, legs aching, and recount his adventures to his comrades over barely warm ale. Some watchmen claimed to have chased off thieves. Others said they'd seen ghosts. Most, though, just agreed it had likely been geese again. And yet, despite the exhaustion, the indifference of the townsfolk, and the mystery mushroom growing in his right boot, he would return the next evening. Because someone had to. So if you think surviving one night as a watchman sounds like a mildly inconvenient adventure, remember, you haven't even met his supervisor. A man known only by the nickname Old Snorebeard. But that's another lantern-lit ramble for another sleepy cobblestone. By the time the stars twinkled above in a soot-speckled London sky, the streets of the city became a theatre of shadows, echoing with distant hooves and the unceremonious clatter of chamber pots being emptied out of upper-story windows. It was a time when most folk wisely curled up by hearth or candlelight indoors, and those who didn't were either up to no good, or tasked with keeping those who were up to no good from doing anything too dreadful. Enter the night watchman, or rather, you, our brave and slightly underqualified night watchman. Bells chimed somewhere in the gloom, marking what the church insisted was 9 o'clock, though timekeeping was still more of an optimistic suggestion than a precise science. You, draped in a cloak that smelled faintly of damp wool, cabbage, and possibly regret, lit your lantern with trembling flint fingers and stepped into the cold English dark. The post wasn't glamorous. You weren't a knight, or a guard, or even fully awake. You were paid in shillings, soup, and sometimes just gratitude expressed through vague nods from the wealthier insomniacs. Your equipment was charmingly insufficient. A staff, long enough to seem threatening from a very specific angle, a wooden rattle for raising the alarm, and your lantern, a fragile box of flame that hissed and flickered like it had its own opinion on your career choices. The job title, Watchman, implied vigilance, but the walking, that was the real trial. Cobbled streets twisted like overcooked spaghetti, and the soles of your shoes were roughly as protective as a damp biscuit. Heaven help you if it rained. Though "if" was a generous word in a city that always seemed mildly soggy. As you shuffled past shuttered shops and taverns fallen silent, you might murmur the regulation call, not because it was helpful, but because it was expected. Past 9 of the clock, and all's well. Was anything well? Well, probably not. You had just passed a suspicious pile of rags that coughed at you. That could be a person, or a cat, or worse, a playwright. Whatever it was, you walked faster. The city's layout didn't help either. Street signs, if they existed, were less helpful than a poet at a sword fight. Directions were often determined by landmarks like the house that smells of fish, or turn left where John the Cooper's shop was, before it got destroyed in last month's fire. Ah, fire, your constant companion and mortal enemy. The one true fear of every night watchman, because the city, at this point in history, was made primarily of wood, straw, more wood, and a worryingly enthusiastic attitude toward open flames indoors. Part of your job was watching for wisps of smoke curling from unseen chimneys, or far worse, yells of fire from some frantic neighbor. If you heard that dreaded word, it was your responsibility to raise the alarm, wake the neighbors, and, should the need arise, form a bucket line with townspeople hurling water into the blaze with the determined aim of drunkards lobbing turnips at a maypole. Except you didn't have turnips. You had sloshing pails passed hand to hand from the nearest water source, usually the Thames, which was not what one would call hygienic. But bacteria hadn't been invented yet in people's imaginations. So the important thing was that it was wet, and that was good enough for the 17th century. And then there were the alley cats. They owned the night more convincingly than you did. With glowing eyes and the casual authority of someone who's seen everything twice already, they watched from shadowy ledges, occasionally yowling with the voice of the devil's accordion. One such cat currently perched above the butcher's doorway, blinking at you indifferently, as if to say, "Go on then, protect the city." Still, some quiet moments made it bearable. The silver hush of moonlight over rooftops, the distant strains of a lute from a tavern that had very much not closed as required by curfew, and the soft tempo of your footsteps. Right before they were joined by another set. Behind you. You paused. The rattle in your gloved hand suddenly felt ridiculously silly. Was it just your echo? Or someone testing curfew laws and your bravery? You turned slowly, lantern held high, to find only the fog swirling, the kind of fog that history books often refer to as pea soup, though if peas had ever been involved in this level of visibility disaster, they should have been thoroughly ashamed. Perhaps it was nothing, or perhaps, but no dramatic reveals yet. You took another breath, deeper this time, fog curling into your lungs like tired lace. Better keep walking, you thought. Still a long night to go, especially when the moon waxes strange and the city's streets start whispering secrets of their own. And so, step by misty step, you patrolled further into the depths of the sleeping city, where gas lamps flicker and stories begin curling like chimney smoke through the night air. In the soft, flickering candlelight of a 17th century back alley, the sort that smells vaguely of chimney soot, wet wool, and whatever the butcher couldn't quite sell by sunset, our brave night watchman takes his first shaky steps into the wind-laced chill of his nightly patrol. His boots, made not of anything nearly so glorious as leather, but rather something resembling boiled felt with optimistic stitching, squish faintly with every step. Rain. Possibly. Rat droppings. Also, possibly. Above him loomed the tall, timber-framed houses, each leaning slightly inward like gossipy old neighbors, whispering drafty secrets down into the street. And beneath the night watchman's heavy woolen cloak, which smells faintly of onion soup and disappointment, his heart beats a little faster. Not from fear, of course, but indigestion. Supper was a bit rushed. Salt pork again, undercooked, again. The job of a night watchman, should you have chosen this noble, if mildly regrettable career, was, at least on paper, rather simple. Remain vigilant, patrol the streets, announce the hour, watch carefully for thieves, fires, rampaging pigs, and, if you're truly unlucky, minor political revolts. You know, the usual. You were instructed to cry out the time and weather at regular intervals, so you might hear something like 2 o'clock and all is well, echoing down the empty streets. Unless, of course, all was not well, in which case you'd quickly decide it was wiser to say nothing at all. But announcing the hour had more pitfalls than one might expect. For one thing, the town's single, beleaguered clock tower wasn't famous for accuracy. Clocks in the 1600s were as much a suggestion as a science, So if you cried 3 o'clock just as the bells tolled 2, well, you could find yourself being corrected by an irate clockkeeper named Geoffrey, who lived above the fishmonger and smelled perpetually of pickled eel. And heaven help you if you forgot to call out the weather. People depended on you. How else would they know it was foggy, other than using, say, their eyes? Let us not forget the terrifying responsibility of fire detection. Since the average house was made of wood, densely packed, and topped with the architectural equivalent of an oiled rag, also known as a thatched roof. Fires had a rather dramatic flair for the theatrical. One spark, and poof, suddenly you're less of a watchman and more of a one-man alarm system in woolen pajamas. Should you spot smoke, you'd be expected to ring your trusty handbell and bellow "fire," a word that would instantly send the neighborhood into an enthusiastic frenzy of tossing chamber pots out the window in confusion. Most people didn't actually own a bucket reserved for fire emergencies, but they did have buckets for other purposes. And then there were the drunks. Oh, the drunks. By divine providence or sheer bad luck, every night included at least one honourable citizen sprawled halfway inside a hedgerow, attempting to sing a folk ballad with only 3 of the required 14 notes. It was your solemn duty to rouse them and escort them home. Except they often didn't know where home was, or who you were, or what century it might be. One fellow, a shoemaker's apprentice named Tom, once declared he was a Dutch prince in exile and challenged the north-facing fence post to a duel. The fence post, having long since given up hope, took the insult stoically. Still, our watchman walks on, lantern bobbing gently at his side, casting golden buttery shadows along the cobblestones. The warm glow dances over shutters drawn tight for the night, over puddles catching the glimmer of moonlight, and over the faint scurry of late-night mischief from creatures decidedly non-princely. Despite the aches in his knees and the curiosity of a cold draught up his garments, a flaw in the tailoring, no doubt, there's a certain peace to it all. The quiet rhythm of footsteps, the familiar creak of a wooden sign swaying in the breeze, and that one rooster that's always early, horribly, violently early. And as the watchman rounds the corner by the old bakery, the one that smells suspiciously of soap now that the baker's married a soap maker, we find him pausing, listening. Something not quite right. A sound, a movement. But no need to be alarmed. It's just the city exhaling its strange, sleepy breath. For now. Let's follow him carefully as he turns down a darker lane into the shadows where trouble often naps lightly and the rats throw very small, very exclusive parties. If you were standing at the gates of a 17th century city at sundown, you'd witness something between an early shift change and an oddly formal game of hide and seek. As townsfolk scuttled home and shopkeepers barred their doors, a thin, clunking figure would emerge from shadow, your fellow for the night, the city watchman. Now, there's something that sounds vaguely noble about a night watchman, isn't there? Upright, diligent, possibly wielding a lantern and muttering something like, "All is well," in the darkness. Ah, but that's the brochure version. Let's peel that candlelit marketing back just a bit, shall we? First things first. The average night watchman in the 1600s was not a spry sword-wielding vigilante. He was likely a man in his 50s, possibly 70s, depending on local hiring standards. By which I mean, who hasn't died yet and can still walk. Old sailors, failed apprentices, and men with voices suspiciously quiet during town meetings were regularly volunteered. Many couldn't afford the fine for saying no. And yes, towns very helpfully fined you if you refuse the honor of wandering dark alleys in the name of public safety. The job went like this: patrol a designated section of town all night, call out the hour at regular intervals, keep an eye out for fires, burglars, or entire armies attempting sneak attacks, and try not to fall asleep in a wine cask. You'd be issued a lantern, a stick of menacing length, and perhaps a whistle if your town was particularly progressive in the acoustical defense arts. One town reportedly gave their watchman a large handbell, which, while impressive, also invited questions about exactly how one was meant to spring a stealthy surprise upon a criminal without inadvertently leading a parade. Clothing varied wildly. Some cities issued uniforms, nothing fancy, unless you consider thick wool and the charismatic aroma of damp goat fancy. In smaller towns, uniform meant you were expected to wear something, anything, and not show up shirtless again, Thomas. Finances were tricky. Some watchmen were paid, but the amount varied depending on your municipality's mood and budget. A few were given leftover food from the town hall, such as bread that had, by all accounts, passed several lifetimes ago. Payment might also come in the form of occasional tips from grateful citizens, though reports suggest these tended to be coins small enough to disappear into a crack in the cobblestone. But fine, let's say you're wide awake. You've got your walking stick, your lantern, your vaguely edible sandwich, and your first problem: darkness. True 17th century darkness didn't have quaint string lights or the guiding glow of a nightlight shaped like a sleepy moon. No, when night came, it was black. Coal in a cave on a cloudy night black. If your lantern went out, you were basically playing blindfolded chess with burglars who'd memorized the board. Now imagine walking through winding alleys, past pig pens and public privies, and the occasional suspiciously scurrying figure in a cloak. You hear soft hoofbeats in the distance, probably a horse, or maybe just the wind playing footsie with some firewood. Either way, you're expected to investigate because your job is, technically, crime deterrence. And then there's the cat. Yes, the cat. Many watchmen in historical records make it very clear the number one cause of panic, false alarms, and tactical blunders was not, in fact, highwaymen. It was cats. Screeching, shadow-leaping, mysterious cats. One particularly expressive diary from 1628 details a guard chasing what he thought was an elven thief for 2 full blocks before realizing it was, once again, old Mistress Pilkett's tomcat, Lucifer. But the watchman couldn't afford to ignore such sounds. In the 1600s, a fire could eat a city quicker than a rumor, and a thief could vanish into the carpenter's shed with your trousers while you were still learning which direction the moon was facing. Then came the calling of the hour. Oh yes, every hour, sometimes even at the half hour, the watchman was to proclaim the time, loudly, in verse. If your town had poetic tendencies, you might hear 1 o'clock and the fires are still. God bless the king and all that's chill. It wasn't always good poetry, but it was enthusiastic, a kind of nocturnal Yelp review of the streets. A sleepy child might hear your voice and nestle deeper under the woolen folds. Someone pacing the floor in worry might find comfort in the sound, and somewhere in the dark, a thief might hear you, smile faintly, and move 2 alleys over. Being a watchman wasn't glamorous. It was exhausting, cold, quiet, and occasionally humiliating. But in their own creaky way, they kept the city breathing through the night. And as the clouds rolled over the moon and your lantern cast long shadows on the damp cobblestones, you'd take a deep breath, nod gravely to no one in particular, and shuffle on. Perhaps next, you'd make your way past the baker's window, not quite immune to the smell of old dough and tomorrow's dreams still rising in the heat. Outside, the streets are dark, damp, and vaguely threatening. But you, dear night watchman, are squinting suspiciously at a cat. Again. It's 2 hours past midnight. The moon, a lazy guardian of the sky, winks behind impatient clouds. The stones beneath your feet are slick with a cocktail of rainwater, muck, and yesterday's discarded eel pie. The smell, a bold melange of chimney soot, chamber pot leftovers, stagnant beer, and something vaguely fish-based that no one dares to identify. But you have a job, a noble job, a job of tremendous responsibility. You are the night watchman, tasked with keeping the peace, spotting fires, rousing the town if the French land unexpectedly, and, more often than not, trying to stay awake while mumbling things like "all's well" and "no Frenchman in sight" on the hour, every hour. And so, as you shuffle past a back alley, stuffed with suspicious cabbage sacks and the lingering wails of a drunk troubadour crying about a lost turkey, your lantern flickers like it too, would rather be in bed. Let's talk about that lantern. Your official issue is a horn lantern. No glass here, far too expensive and shatterable. Just thin, translucent slices of horn scraped down until they glow like the fingernails of a mildly enchanted goat. The candle inside is stubborn, smoky, slightly judgmental, and keeps threatening to go out during every critical moment, especially when you think you see a shadow sneaking across the churchyard. You wiggle it. It flares briefly, bathing the leering stone gargoyle ahead in sickly yellow light. Ah, just another rain barrel wearing an abandoned bonnet. You continue your patrol, a zigzagging route through cobbled streets that seem to shift subtly when you're not looking. No public clocks, no street signs. You navigate by smell, sound, and the way the plaster leans slightly on Mrs. Cadwell's house when the wind's from the west. Now, your ears are tuned for danger, for the whispered scrape of a cut purse's boot, or the unmistakable fist of spontaneous combustion, which happens more often than one might prefer in buildings constructed primarily of disgruntled straw. But most nights, like this one, your main adversary is boredom, and your own mind convincing you that your shoelace is a snake. In theory, fellow watchmen are posted at intervals through the district. In practice, they are likely napping upright in doorways or off sharing a warm cod pasty behind year-old pub that still technically has a roof. You, however, are diligent. You keep walking. Avoid the puddles, too late, and tap your halberd against the stone curb every so often to remind the horses and yourself that you are still very much real. Ah yes, the halberd, the ceremonial stick of authority, part axe, part spear, fully impractical in narrow alleyways and sweeping corners. But the mere sight of it can deter mischief. In theory. In one memorable case, it also broke a bakery window when a new recruit tripped on a chicken. And still, modern listeners may ask, what's the point of wandering the streets in the dark when you can't really see much, can't chase anything fast, and sometimes fall asleep standing against a soot-slicked wall? Well, 17th century cities ran on the idea that being visibly watchful discouraged crime. A bit like a sleepy scarecrow deterring crows, as long as the scarecrow keeps mumbling, "Past 4 o'clock, and all's well." Of course, none of this stops the local pranksters. Some nights, children leave wooden shoes in suspicious-looking piles just to see if you'll sound the alarm. Other nights, tipsy aristocrats in poorly secured wigs challenge you to duels by poetry. You decline, firmly, and it's somewhere near the Tanner's district, where the scent of boiling animal parts curls like a sinister ribbon into your nostrils, that you spot it. The faint red glow in the distance, steady, unnatural and warming, not in the metaphorical way. Your candle trembles, you blink, rub your eyes, and start to hobble faster. Fires, after all, are no joke in tightly packed timbered cities. A single spark and the whole row of homes could go up like disgruntled matchsticks at a tavern rally. And so, clutching your halberd, heart thumping louder than the bells from St. Clement's Tower, you shuffle, wobble, and finally jog-trot toward the glow, prepared to raise the alarm, whether it's an unattended hearth or just a cozy pile of foxes doing yoga. Well, that remains to be seen. Let's wander closer, shall we? The night isn't over yet. If you were to peel back the foggy curtain of a 17th century night, say somewhere between the hours known only by cats and drunk poets, you'd likely stumble upon a figure bundled in layers of wool and dampness, pacing slowly beneath a smoky moon. The night watchman, noble in purpose if not in paycheck, and at his side, a lantern, a staff, and, should misfortune strike, a bladder just full enough to make the night absolutely miserable. And make no mistake, misfortune almost always struck. You see, for all the drama surrounding Gothic cathedrals and newly minted laws printed with extreme seriousness, nightly patrol duties were often defeated by a more old-fashioned foe, old-fashioned plumbing. That is to say, there wasn't any. Our brave keeper of the peace might have started his shift with good spirits and a confident bladder, but 17 cups of weak ale and the constant dripping of leaky wooden gutters above could reduce the steeliest man to a wide-eyed, shivering whisper of his former self. During warmer months, perhaps a quick duck behind a hay cart might do. But in deep winter, when even thoughts could freeze if spoken too slowly, the equation became far more delicate. And yet, ambitions for bladder relief were only a footnote in a night watchman's log of discomforts. Indeed, if he had a logbook, though most scribbled records looked less like an official report and more like erratic notes taken by a distracted squirrel. Imagine the cobbled streets of a town that didn't trust dreams. Not because dreams were dangerous, but because sleep was reserved for those who could afford safety. Everyone else kept a candle lit. The watchman, trudging past shuttered taverns and huddled corners, was expected to prevent fires, catch criminals, and occasionally chastise late-night serenaders who seemed romantic until they hit their 8th verse of My Fairest Partridge. Rain could arrive sideways, and snow had a curious habit of finding the one spot between your collar and your neck. Sleepwalkers were rare but not unknown, and there were always the noisier kind, sleep talkers, shouting ancient family gossip in their front gardens while fully unconscious. The watchman was not only a guard, he was sometimes, begrudgingly, a reluctant therapist. And then there was the great nemesis of all watchers of the night, chimney noises. Now, to the unseasoned ear, a chimney groaning in the middle of the night might be dismissed as wind or soot settling. But to a 17th century watchman, steeped in caution and soaked in laughter he was forbidden to express, every creak of a flue was potential calamity. Could be a fire, could be a raccoon planning revolution, could be Satan again. Best not to assume. Sometimes a chimney did catch fire, not with the dramatic roar of hell's fury, but with the oddest, almost elegant cracking glow, as if the building itself wanted to confess something sinful to the night. Our watchman was supposed to carry a rattle, a little wooden instrument meant to break the silence and summon aid. But on more than one occasion, the rattle had been borrowed by children earlier that day in an impromptu game of Banish the Goblin, and no one remembered to return it. There's something heartbreakingly human about the watchman patrolling past houses where warm stew once cooked earlier that evening, peering into the faintest yellow gleams slipping through drawn curtains. The smell of barley and root vegetables, long since cooled, wafts temptingly through cracks in the wall. He sighs and tightens his cloak. He's not there to eat. He's there to protect. Though his track record is mainly discovered the incident just after it ended. And still he walked, slowly, deliberately, swinging his lantern in circles, not entirely for visibility, but to keep it from extinguishing in the wind. Humming tunes he wasn't supposed to know. Left foot, right foot, echo, echo. Midnight tolls, softly, from the church tower. 3 minutes late because the bell pull has frozen slightly. No, one minds. Time, after all, was an approximation at best in an era where most clocks ticked in stiff, awkward hesitation, like they were riddled with self-doubt. And as our poor, dutiful watchman trudges past the tanner's yard, where a very forgotten goat has learned to moo convincingly enough to startle some passers-by, he adjusts his cap and readies himself for what remains of the shift. For something unusual, something mysterious, is always just one corner away. A flicker of light, a whiff of sulphur perhaps. Or was it just a baker stumbling home with a torch and a pie? What he finds next may surprise even him. But first, just a few more steps into shadow. Outside, the fog begins to curl like old parchment in the lamplight. It creeps along the cobblestones with all the enthusiasm of a cat who's just learned the meaning of the word baths. And through that dense, misty soup, our brave and increasingly thoroughly chilled night watchman marches on, pike in hand, dignity somewhere several streets behind. Our watchman is now entering what polite society of the day would euphemistically call the lesser alleyways, areas of town so narrow and poorly lit that even rats demanded street names. These were the spaghetti strand veins of the city, a labyrinthine reminder that 17th century urban planning was often just a game of chicken between drunk builders and gravity. It's here in these alleys that a watchman's senses had to be sharper than a cheese merchant during Lent. Every rustle could be a cut purse, or a drunk cat, or a cat drunk on the remains of a spilled ale keg, all equally alarming. Street lighting, you ask? Ah, yes. Picture, if you will, a well-lit modern city street. Now remove all your expectations. In the 1600s, city lighting was intensely theoretical. While some wealthier cities like Amsterdam had begun experimenting with oil lanterns on poles, in many places, street illumination was considered a luxury, like scented soap or not dying of scurvy. London, for instance, dabbled with the idea of making householders hang lanterns outside their homes. It sounded like a neat idea at the time, until homeowners realized oil was expensive. Glass panes broke if you looked at them wrong, and that climbing up a ladder at night to light a flame while holding an open container of flammable liquid was, frankly, a terrible Tuesday chore. So most alleys were lit only by whatever glow shone down from upstairs windows, assuming someone up there wasn't already asleep, or blind, or both. Our watchman pauses at a junction marked only by a faint chalk sign someone scrawled above a tavern door, the Snoring Duck, a promising establishment, potentially no less dangerous than the alleys themselves. Taverns of the 17th century were hubs of warmth, occasional music, and frequent regret, like jazz clubs run by pirates. The watchman resists the urge to duck in for an ale and a bit of sausage pie. He is, after all, technically still on patrol. And if he were caught, the punishment was a stern rebuke and the possibility of losing a good spot in the annual Watchman's mince pie exchange. Instead, he trudges on, his boots squelching faintly through something that might be water or beer, or something we shall identify as urban mystery liquid. Let's not dwell. Passing a row of shuttered stalls, he notes yet another instance where the whole watch and ward job title falls slightly apart. With no centralized police force and municipal funds allocated mostly to plague pits and lords' parties, nighttime crime prevention was rather dependent on the watchman's courage, hearing, and whether or not he'd had 3 helpings of stew before sunset. And then there's the matter of passwords. Yes, passwords. Not of the digital kind naturally. These were spoken passwords intended to differentiate honest citizens from ne'er-do-wells. Each night, the Lord Mayor or similar official might issue a new phrase, something inspiring and unguessable like "God save the King" or "Foxglove and Turnip." Woe betide the forgetful watchman who stumbled across a patrol from another ward and gave the wrong password. Best case scenario, a stern talking to and an invitation to learn it properly next time. Worst case, a pike handle to the ribs and a write-up in the morning scandal sheet. Our hero remembers tonight's password just in time as a pair of men in similarly ragged uniforms and sleep-deprived expressions emerge from the opposite end of the lane. "Who goes there?" one calls out hoarsely. "The watch," our man replies. "Password." He stares up at the stars, as if the heavens will whisper it back. "Ah yes, pickled partridge." The 2 men nod sagely, clearly a code chosen by someone who skipped lunch. With the formalities completed, the fellow watchmen exchange grumbles about the weather, discuss the finer points of lantern maintenance, and share rumours about a goose seen chasing a nobleman into a barrel earlier that evening. Allegedly, that goose was possessed, or at the very least, militantly territorial. They part ways under the soft flicker of a swinging lantern, promising to meet again come dawn, or sooner if they're bitten. And as our watchman rounds another crooked corner, heading deeper into the alleys where even moonlight hesitates, he finds his mind wandering, not to dreams just yet, but to something possibly more treacherous, curfew bells, and the mischief made by those who ignored them. But that, of course, is its own kind of night story. Despite the job description suggesting a life of mystery and lantern-lit authority, being a night watchman in a 17th century city was less cloak and dagger and more damp cloak and bladder control. And if there was a natural enemy to the night, the true villain lurking in every cobblestone crevice, it was the weather. Ah yes, the noble European climate. Romanticized. Today as moody and poetic, the reality was more anguished chicken in a puddle. Cities like London, Amsterdam or Prague served up a buffet of elemental chaos. Rain didn't so much fall as it loitered ominously above your head, waiting to drench morale. Wind was not a gentle sigh, but a disgruntled spirit disguised as air, flapping cloaks, extinguishing lanterns, and carrying suspicious smells across alleys with alarming commitment. The night watchman's uniform, if we can be so generous as to call it that, wasn't exactly built for meteorological resilience. Picture coarse wool that soaked up rain quicker than a poet's diary soaks up tears. The hat, either an enormous brimmed thing that collected water like a rooftop gutter or something, knit by a well-meaning spouse that shrank into a forehead muffin the first time it met drizzle. Boots were proudly worn, but rarely waterproof. Most contributors to trench foot were not war, but wet socks and humble civic duty. And then there was snow. Snow despite its storybook charm, turned your midnight patrol into a sort of soft-footed ballet. Not the elegant kind where you glide. No, the kind where each icy cobble conspires to introduce your spine to the ground. To truly imagine it, picture a polite shuffle between frozen manure heaps atop uneven stones while cradling a lantern like a sacred pudding. Not easy on the dignity or the knees. Now let us not forget fog, a constant companion in many cities thanks to coal stoves, swampy rivers, and the casual burning of almost anything that looked vaguely burnable. This mist didn't just obscure your path, it consumed it. Imagine announcing the hour as per protocol, 3 o'clock and all is well, only to hear a disembodied voice 10 feet away mutter, "Is it though?" followed by a suspicious splash. Lanterns, despite being the watchman's most prized possession, were deeply unreliable in this soup of damp air and urban gusts. Fueled by whale oil, tallow, or any number of pungent substances, these little glass boxes flickered bravely until the next sneeze of wind declared them extinguished. Lighting them again required flint, steel, a practiced hand, and a surprising amount of muttered obscenities, though, of course, in those days, swearing was subject to fines, unless you passed it off as biblical reference. But perhaps the most treacherous weather wasn't the storm, or snow, or the creaky, sinister fog. It was the still chill, those nights where the air hovered just cold enough to bite, yet offered no drama, no poetry, just the slow seep of bone-deep discomfort. You'd shuffle along empty streets, your breath curling upward like ghosts disapproving of your career choices, while every creak from a shutter or sudden hoot of an owl made your skin do a light jog of dread. Still, the weather wasn't merely a passive torment. It had a talent for assisting crime. It could mask a thief's footsteps, carry away a scream, or muffle the gallop of a fleeing horse. In fact, if ancient elements had a union, they would have lobbied nightly for more fog and less visibility to boost local petty theft economies. There were even theories among some watchmen that mischievous weather was a sort of divine punishment for towns growing too proud, or for someone somewhere having the impudence to whistle indoors. Now and then, to lift spirits and dry out socks, a nearby alehouse would offer a post-tour mug of something vaguely warm. But it was a risky business. The moment you stepped inside, squelching and shivering, your captain or bishop or some other crusty authority would emerge from the shadows like a damp ghost to remind you that you were the guardian of midnight virtue, not a connoisseur of mead and puddles. And so, most watchmen endured the weather with quiet, sodden dignity, one foot in front of the other, hand on lantern, eyes squinting into the dark, for duty, for their city, and for the faint hope that perhaps tomorrow night the rain might forget to show up. But the clouds rarely forgot. There are, however, darker clouds still, a different sort, made not of storm and sleet, but of menace and mischief stirring beyond the city gates. A heavy fog hangs over the cobbled streets like an old woolen blanket someone forgot to launder. Your boots, soaked through since moonrise, squelch faintly with each reluctant step. Somewhere in the impossibly distant past, read 3 hours ago, you had toes. At least, you're quite sure you did. It's difficult to say now, considering how your feet, and frankly, most of your extremities, have filed for separation on account of frostbite and artistic differences. The bells in the tower above St. Olaf's Chapel chime the 3rd hour. Not that you can see the tower through the fog, or the chapel, or indeed anything beyond the vague outline of your own nose. Your lantern stub of a candle casts a pathetic, flickering glow that might be more useful illuminating moral ambiguity than actual streets. But that's all you've got. That and a long staff, which has a spiked end only slightly more dangerous than the splinters in its handle. Together, you and your questionable equipment are entrusted with the safety of this medieval metropolis. It's around this hour, the drowsy cusp when all things logical take a nap and dream things rise to stroll the alleys, that noises begin to feel like warnings. Creaking shutters, shifting roof tiles, a low moan that might be the wind, or an elderly cat, or some combination of the two. Every sound seems to say, you are entirely alone, and everything is probably haunted. You take comfort in traditions, for instance, calling the hours. On the quarter hours, it is your noble duty to proclaim the time. A useful alert for those counting candles, and pure entertainment for those lying abed, enjoying the knowledge that they are not you. You grip your cold lantern and bellow, with as much warmth as you can fake. 3 of the clock and all's we. Your voice breaks, perhaps on purpose, perhaps due to the sudden realization that you are now standing in a puddle with the consistency and temperature of witch's soup. You step backward, too far. Your boot strikes the edge of what turns out to be nothing, just pure unadulterated street void, a missing cobblestone, and you fall, not far, just enough to lose dignity and perhaps dislodge an important sense of direction. Now sprawled in the mud, listening to the soothing scurry of passing rats, you begin to sense the true spiritual underpinning of night watchmanship. Resignation. But up you go, at least eventually. You are, if nothing else, ambulatory. You limp past a bakery, one small window still glowing with inner hearth light. Bread will be ready with the rising sun. Its unseen baker, having been up since midnight, ranks among the few souls less well rested than yourself. You imagine him kneading dough with the quiet rage of someone who smelled sweet yeast for 12 hours, but cannot eat any of it because it's not yet his lunch break. Ah, but your thoughts of bread are swiftly interrupted. There's movement there, down an alley near the tannery. A clatter, a thump, a whisper. Now, allow me to paint a picture. In the 17th century, a tannery is not a place but a warning. If you've never had the pleasure, imagine the aroma of industrial sadness. Urine, lime, and rotting flesh all mingling into a bouquet that says, "Do not fall asleep here, ever." Tile-roofed and foul, these were the most stunt-resistant areas of the town. Anyone sniffing about one's alleyway at 3 a.m. is either a thief, a very confused monk, or in possession of a deeply questionable sense of romance. You tighten your grip on your staff, more for moral support than any actual defense, and shuffle in the direction of the noise. What do you find? Only a cat, large, triumphant, proud of a fish it stole from someone. Maybe you, maybe society. You lock eyes for a moment in mutual recognition. Brave creatures prowling the night, unwanted and underpaid. You decide not to report it. Heading back up the hill, you encounter a shutter pushed open and a head poking through. An elderly woman with magnificent hair that moves like a sea anemone in the night wind. "Oh, it's you," she says. "Thought I smelled tallow and pessimism." You nod solemnly, accepting this as fair. She tosses you a heel of bread, not fresh, possibly from an earlier century, but edible-ish. As you chew thoughtfully, you take your post near the eastern wall gate, watching the stars above blink reluctantly back at you. The night continues, quiet now, as if it too has grown weary of itself. And just as your eyelids begin an unauthorized descent, something moves beyond the gate's outer path. A figure, perhaps, or just a trick of the fog, which of course you will need to investigate. After all, you are the Watchman. For now. A hush settles over the narrow alleys. The moon, peeking shyly through a quilt of clouds, casts just enough light to emphasize how many places someone could be lurking in a 17th century city without you seeing them. Welcome to the midnight corner of your shift as a night watchman, where even shadows seem to have secrets. By this time of night, your lantern's little flame flickers like it's considering early retirement. Soot has crept up the glass, tinting everything in sepia moodiness. It's not long before you realize you're not actually seeing much at all, just vague outlines and your own breath curling like a question into the cold. You're halfway through the 4th hour of your watch. Your feet have the consistency of undercooked dumplings, somehow both numb and painful. And then comes the worst enemy of all, boredom. Not a gentle boredom, the kind that leads to a daydream. No, this is the slow simmering variety that cooks your spirit in its own juices. You'd trade your soul for a pigeon fight outside the tavern right about now. Just something to break the silence buzzing in your ears. Of course, just as the silence reaches its crescendo, you hear something you'd rather not. Footsteps. Now, in 2024, footsteps might be an Amazon delivery or someone walking their elderly, irritable beagle. Here, it could be a thief, a wayward goat, or someone so astronomically drunk they've mistaken the cathedral for their front door. You round a corner, lantern raised high like a tiny lighthouse of mild authority. Who goes there? You call out, because that's what your supervisor said you're meant to ask, though you always feel a little ridiculous. After all, no one ever responds. Oh, just a nefarious highwayman. Carry on. Tonight, the answer is worse. Laughter. A high-pitched, cider-fueled cackle that tumbles through the alley like loose barrels after a tavern fire. You clutch your halberd, essentially a long pole with more confidence than real stopping power, like it might know what to do. The culprits, or perhaps merely participants in their own whimsical catastrophe, appear. 2 young tradesmen from the tannery, arm in arm and staggering to a song only they can hear. One has shoes, the other does not. Their breath smells like fermented apples and poor decisions. Get on home, you mutter with a hoarse grumble. Official enough to fulfill your duty, but not so stern that you have to write anything down. They giggle again and disappear around the corner, probably to redecorate someone's doorstep with half-digested pottage. You take a slow breath. This is the delicate rhythm of the night. Stillness, worry, a minor incident, then stillness again, this time tinged with a vague sense of accomplishment. You didn't die. You didn't fall asleep. You didn't even lose your lantern this time. Things are looking up, but the streets are never truly abandoned. Somewhere off to the left, behind the fishmonger's stall that smells like a Viking sock, a cat watches you with the particular disdain only 17th century cats could master. She does not fear you. She owns this street in a way you never will. Up ahead, a church bell tolls one single, honest clang, and with it, a subtle shift begins. The air thickens. You feel it in your spine. The witching hour. This was not a time of magic tricks and pointy hats. In early modern Europe, this hour was when superstition pulled extra hours. People feared it was the hour when the spiritually wayward roamed. Not just drunks and stray pigs, but worse, the uncanny sort. And you remember now, a whispered tale from your aunt about the time she found a cart driver speaking Latin backward into a goat's ear. You shake it off gently. After all, what would a night watchman be doing, fearing superstitions? Just because people regularly buried cloves in their shoes and carried dried toad bones for protection doesn't mean you should be alarmed, right? Still, your grip on the halberd tightens and your eyes scan windows for candlelight, because the living aren't the only things that wake at night. In the distance, an old wooden sign swings lazily in the breeze. It creaks like it's trying to share a secret it's held for far too long. And behind you, was that the sound of... No, must have been the wind. Just the wind. Better keep moving. With the hour darkening and the stories deepening, your patrol continues. Into a night that doesn't seem quite finished revealing itself. Somewhere just past midnight, in a town square muffled by soot and mist, a hunched figure meanders along the cobbles, muttering to himself about lantern oil and grog. The moon hangs above like an indifferent landlord. You, the beleaguered night watchman, have been working this post all winter, and it shows. Your hands smell like tallow, your coat smells like fireplace envy, and your eyes blink out of sync. Tonight, the enemy is not lurking thieves or drunken shoemakers flinging bread rolls at one another again. No. Tonight, the adversary is subtler, more cunning. Frostbite. You were told to wear layers, handed a woolen cloak with the comforting texture of a church pew. But no one mentioned the wind. The 17th century wind doesn't whisper. It lunges. It races around cornerstones and accuses your ears of poor judgment. And unlike modern thermals and smart wool socks, your only defense is a scarf knitted by someone's aunt in 1598, who clearly disliked people with necks. You attempt to warm yourself near a brazier, a small iron firepot left out by the richer shop owners in a rare show of generosity or liability management. The flames lick the air like curious cats. You crouch, grateful. But not for long, because here comes old Hob, the town's designated chronic insomniac and passionate mumbler. Old Hob is armed with a mug of something suspicious and a story longer than Lent. He believes the devil lives in the fish market and that geese are spies for foreign powers. You, as the night watchman, are obligated to nod and agree, lest he report you to the alderman for being implicated in witch hats. The term makes no sense. That's not the point. Historical note: community gossip was as essential to a 17th century town as timber framing and bread with rocks in it. And a night watchman, visible and underpaid, often collected more rumours than arrests. Your ledger of truths now includes: the baker's wife is actually two people. The blacksmith talks to horses, and they answer back. The mayor hasn't aged because he bathes in gravy. Meanwhile, the official instructions you were given on your first night, written in a crabby calligraphy, state plainly: prevent fires, calm drunks, and announce the hours in a clear voice. Noble in theory. In practice, it goes more like: it is the hour of 1. All be well. The hour is roaming. Maybe 5. Time is fluid. Oh, dew hath settled on yon banister. All not well. Your announcements are supposed to reassure the townsfolk, although it's not clear how much good it does when you holler them at full volume near the windows of sleeping merchants. Yesterday, someone hurled a pickled onion at you. You hadn't even reached 2 of the clock. Passing the tanner's yard, you brace yourself. The smell assaults you like a disgruntled choir. Tanning in the 17th century was a highly aromatic endeavour, involving copious use of urine, animal brains, and something called pounding the hides, which is not a dance move, but perhaps should be. The horror is such that even rats approach the tannery with contract negotiations. You press a kerchief to your face and stagger onward, sinuses ablaze. Patrolling the north end of town, you hear it again. The bell. Not the church bell. Nothing sanctified. No, this is a trader's bell tied to a cart, announcing the midnight delivery of pickled herrings from the docks. The fishmonger waves cheerfully. You wave back. You're fairly certain one of the barrels winked at you. Sleep would be a mercy, but you are not allowed that decadence. Instead, there is the cold, the repetition, and the humble glory of it all. Somewhere in the distance, a cock crows far too early, confused like everyone else who's up at this hour. You sigh, a foggy little prayer to the air. The torch in your hand flickers uncertainly as your shift trundles forward. Behind a crooked shutter, someone stirs. A baby cries. A dog barks at something only it can see, perhaps a ghost, or just the pitying moon. And as you trudge past the hanging sign of the inn, shaped like a half-unbuttoned boot, you hear the soft shuffle of hooves approaching. But before we meet the peculiar rider of that ill-timed steed, take a breath. Let the frost melt from your mind and drift gently along the rooftops where even the chimneys sleep. It was somewhere between the third toll of the half-hour bell and your knees beginning to genuinely consider early retirement that you spotted the telltale wobble of a man approaching from the direction of the west gate. Now, this might not seem suspicious to modern ears. Perhaps he simply enjoyed the bracing freshness of a 2 a.m. stroll after a meat-heavy supper. But in the well-paranoid mind of a 17th-century night watchman, everything after sunset required at least moderate suspicion and, ideally, a poking stick. He weaved gently side to side like a weathercock caught in a conflicted breeze. And you, well, you clutched your halberd like a decorative shield maiden in a community theatre reenactment. This was your moment. The public drunkard, the living embodiment of city ordinance volume 30, subsection Zoku. Ye shalt not be muddled in public, even if your aunt died. This, finally, was the criminal opportunity, for which you'd been poorly trained and underpaid. You rustled your rattle. Yes, the world's least intimidating law enforcement tool was, in fact, a literal rattle, and stepped forward with the infinitely embarrassing cry of, "Stand and declare yourself in the king's peace." The man stopped, or rather, physics took a brief drink break, and he simply ran out of momentum. "Good night to ye, officer," he slurred, with the cheerful optimism of someone whose night had gone entirely sideways, but remained proud of himself. "Lovely weather, if you don't look too hard." "Have you been drinking?" you asked, trying to channel righteous authority, but achieving something closer to an awkward uncle at a suspicious christening. "Oh yes," he replied brightly, swaying with drunken dignity. "I consider my liver a resilient foe." And here was your dilemma. The law was exquisitely clear. Public inebriation could earn a night in the stocks or, if especially lively, a brief tossing in the nearest lockup. However, so was its ambiguity. The punishment was at the discretion of any trusted night guard, which, tragically, was you. Let us pause here to appreciate your predicament more richly. In your modern life, perhaps you've struggled with a coffee order or a frayed charging cable. Frustrating, yes, but not morally taxing. But here, on this cobbled corner in the biting air of 1642, you must judge whether Mr. Involuntary Pirouette is a danger to society or merely a hazard to his own trousers. You settle on compromise. "It's late," you intone. "Best you visit home before the moon catches you muttering." To your relief, he nods and wobbles off, offering you a salute that hits his own face. Smoke rising from distant hearths curls into the night, and somewhere, most unfairly, a dog is asleep in smug comfort. You envy whole species now. But vigilance cannot waver. You continue your rounds, ticking off checkpoints with the diligence of someone grading their own homework. The tannery district remains peacefully pungent. The fishmonger's cart is mercifully empty, you recall with horror cleaning that up in spring, and the city's lone fire bucket chain slumps lazily behind the chapel, wrapped more in hope than readiness. You hear a shutter creak, just once, like a book being opened by the wind's lazy fingers. You spin, overcompensate, and temporarily forget how feet are meant to work together. After a masterclass in spontaneous interpretive flailing, you stabilize against a wall and peer upward. Nothing, just shadows, and the slight suspicion that the moon might be laughing. Still, any open shutter at night might signal a thief, a rogue, or simply a householder who had one too many pickled eels and needed air. You knock on the door, in part from duty, in part because it has conveniently presented itself as a support structure for your pride. A face peeks out, gaunt and candlelit. An old woman, not particularly impressed by your role, nor by the fact that you're holding your halberd the wrong way around. "You're letting the cold in," she snaps, and shuts the door with finality. Thus scolded, you press on, cloaked not just in night and mist, but in the ever-accumulating fog of existential uncertainty that comes with authority and absolutely no idea what you're doing. Still, you did your duty. You patrolled. You judged the drunk with wisdom befitting a man who hadn't slept in 37 hours, and you survived the shutter incident with only minor emotional scarring. As bells toll 3, slow, round, bone deep, you take your place again near the smithy's forge, where warmth oozes through the stones, like an old dog refusing to move off a sunny cushion. You settle in, halberd across your lap, and allow your breath to fog gently outward, a brief silver thread in the dark air. The city sleeps on, but you have a suspicious rooster to deal with soon. Best not to think about it yet. Let the hours pass unnoticed, like politely uninvited guests. In the snug darkness of a candle-lit alleyway, beneath the flickering shadows of a crooked shop sign advertising truthful weighing of bread, mostly, you, the freshly appointed 17th century night watchman, are about to face your most formidable adversary yet. Not a thief, nor a fire, nor even a man suspiciously holding a goose like a weapon. No. Tonight, you're up against an ancient, unstoppable force, the city's chamber pots. Ah yes, the humble yet potent slop bucket. By the 1600s, the chamber pot was less a convenience and more a missile, strategically stationed beneath beds and kept full of thunderous purpose. When morning sanitation systems could be summed up by the phrase "out the window," walking beneath upper floor residences required a brave soul, a long cloak, and a healthy disregard for the phrase liquid assets. As night watchman, your duties unfortunately extend beyond mere crime and curfews. You, friend, are also a human sponge for public grievances and occasional airborne excretions. Now, contrary to popular belief, chamber pot etiquette did exist. In many cities, it was considered polite to yell "Gardiloo" before hurling last night's digestive regrets onto the cobblestone runway below. Gardiloo, borrowed lovingly from the French gardez-l'eau. Literally, beware of the water. Though a more honest translation might be, I hope you weren't planning to walk here unsoiled. But etiquette tends to fade around 2 a.m., especially when ale has been involved. Picture yourself trudging through the sleeping city, your lantern casting long, shy glows onto the walls. A sudden shout echoes above, "Gardiloo!" By the time your poor, weary brain processes the syllables, you're officially baptized by bucket. Your cloak sags with the weight of communal consequence. You smell like someone boiled despair. Practically speaking, there were efforts to manage waste. Many towns had regulations ordering that filth be taken to specified dumping grounds, though enforcement was spotty and enthusiasm thinner still. Hauling a full chamber pot down 5 flights of rickety stairs wasn't exactly a dawn fantasy. So out the window it went. Voila, airborne history. Some night watchmen carried staff-mounted bells to announce their approach, ostensibly to warn the shady and the shiftless, but in reality, the bells likely served as a kind of ultrasonic "don't dump on me" song, a creature call of mild desperation. I walk below, please spare me. And even those watchmen with fast reflexes and faster feet weren't immune. The more seasoned among them developed uncanny foresight, able to duck suspicious windows or hold cloaks aloft just in time. Young guards, however, were often decorated with more layers of city life than they would have liked. It's not just the indignity. There were health implications too. Chamber pot contents weren't simply gross. They were epidemically ambitious. Night watchmen breathed the gentle aroma of miasma, the old-timey notion that diseases traveled by bad air, making them unintentional connoisseurs of microbial ambience. And no, wearing one of those long-nosed plague doctor masks wasn't standard issue. That delightful beak full of herbs was largely reserved for doctors, though the idea of equipping every city watchman with a giant crow face carries great comedic potential. Imagine slipping in something unspeakable while trying to maintain serious beak-based authority. Not ideal. Of course, the real tragedy here lies in the optimism of urban planning. Streets were narrow, windows were many, and gravity knew no sleep. Architects hadn't quite accounted for what happens when every building becomes a potential waste waterfall. But let's not be too hard on them. They were figuring things out, one unfortunate puddle at a time. And amid it all stood the night watchman, hunched but heroic, wiping municipal misery from his boots. Eventually, dawn would come, washing the streets in pale sunlight. The city would stir, people would pretend not to notice the still glimmering puddles, and the watchman, soaked and squelching, would shuffle home, valiantly having survived another shift. Another night dodging the rooftops' revenge, the sneaky miasmas, and the sudden plop-plop of midnight misfortune. And so, as the street starts to quiet once more and a cat tiptoes across your path, perhaps it's time to turn your lantern down low and listen for other sounds in the dark. Because beyond waste and weary footsteps, the city has other things whispering in the shadows, and your next duty waits just around the corner. By now, your boots have worn thin, your lantern's oil is low, and your patience, if it ever existed, has likely slinked off into the fog with the stray dogs. Still, on you trudge, the eternal silhouette of civic responsibility, albeit with a wobbly gait, and perhaps a questionable understanding of direction. You see, being a night watchman in a 17th century city wasn't simply about pacing back and forth muttering patriotic phrases. No, it was also about standing completely still for unconscionable amounts of time, especially in front of doors that didn't belong to you. Allow me to introduce you to the ancient art of door watching. Yes, that's right. City watchmen were often assigned specific doors to guard overnight, particularly in wealthier neighborhoods where privacy and paranoia elbowed each other fiercely for space. The logic went something like this. If someone wanted to sneak out for a midnight tryst, or, more inconveniently, sneak in to redistribute household valuables without permission, the watchman was to be both deterrent and alarm system. A 6-hour meat statue with occasional whistling privileges. Of course, the issue with guarding doors was all of them looked remarkably like each other in the dark. Thatched roofs, creaky hinges, possibly a cat staring judgmentally from a windowsill. You could easily spend 10 minutes admiring someone else's barn door while your assigned post stood lonely down the lane. Some mistakes were only discovered come sunrise, when an irate homeowner wondered why you protected a goat pen all night. To keep spirits up and organs warm, many watchmen adopted odd little rituals. Some softly sang psalms. Others mumbled popular ballads of the day, substituting words they forgot with hearty hums or the occasional sneeze. One particularly legendary watchman in Norwich was known for composing haikus about the cold. An example from a document of questionable authenticity reads, "Frost on my eyebrows. Rat just stole my breakfast scone. Please let me go home." Romantic? Hardly. But poetic, in the fashion of desperate men with leather caps and chattering teeth. Now, speaking of cold, let's talk about cloaks. No watchman worth his salt, and salt they tried to be paid in, until someone realized wages work better when they weren't. Edible, ventured out without a thick woolen cloak. And by thick, we do mean somewhere between warm enough to repel alpine wind and heavy enough to squash a small sheep. These cloaks were dome-like, nearly floor length, and had an unfortunate tendency to soak up puddles with the enthusiasm of a thirsty sponge. When it rained, which was quite often in cities like London or Edinburgh, you essentially became a walking wet rug with a pike. Standing there trying to look authoritative while your outerwear slowly evolved into a dripping mass of mildew was no easy task. Some cloaks weighed upwards of 10 pounds when drenched. As one satirical pamphlet from 1682 put it, "A watchman in rain is neither man nor mop, but some woeful mixture of the two." Still, the cloak had its advantages. Wrapped properly, it could be used as a makeshift seat, a shield from chamber pot assaults, or, in times of desperate boredom, transformed into a puppet stage to pass the hours with horrific shadow dramas. Some emotionally resilient watchmen performed puppet shows for stray alley cats. Reviews were mixed. Some watchmen even had dogs, though city records rarely specify whether these were official companions or persistent strays who found the men's dry, crumbling biscuits to be acceptable midnight fare. Either way, the dogs did add a degree of warmth, physically, and in the rare moment of shared eye contact that said, "Yes, friends, we both might freeze to death, but at least we're doing it professionally." Now, you might be wondering whether the citizens appreciated such dedication. The answer is, sort of. They liked the idea of watchmen, much in the way one likes the idea of a weather vane or a municipal statue. But complaints were plentiful. Too loud, too quiet, too drunk, not drunk enough. In waking hours, some watchmen were gently chastised for their nocturnal behavior. Others were enthusiastically pelted with rotten cabbage, a growth industry in those days. Still, with the city asleep and the moon peeking out between chimney stacks, there were moments of magic too. Moments when the stillness of the hour, broken only by the flutter of wings or the soldierly stomp of your fellow sentries, reminded you that you were part of something larger, a creature of the night, though less a bat and more a bewildered goose in wool. But what's that sound? A bell ringing timidly in the distance. Come now, there's a new scandal brewing 2 streets over, and possibly something worse than scandal. Best tighten that cloak. We're off again. With the stars winking like bored bureaucrats above the rooftops of a drowsy 17th century city, our brave, if occasionally bewildered, night watchman turns once more to what might be the era's most underrated tool of terror, the rattle. No, not a baby's rattle, though imaginatively The two have similar purposes: to make a lot of noise when something unpleasant is about to happen. This rattle was the medieval precursor to a police siren, fashioned of simple wood, carved like a paddle, and affixed with rotating slats. When spun, it released an insectile whirring noise that could wake household pets, worry oblivious milkmaids, and ensure any nefarious characters caught in the act would immediately trip over their own attempt at villainy. To use it correctly, one was to brandish the rattle skyward and spin it with dramatic flair at the first whiff of crime. Though city bylaws were admittedly vague on defining how one detects a whiff of crime. Perhaps it was the scent of overripe cheese turning out its pockets in a dark alley, or a rat with an unusually guilty expression. But most common, of course, was the use of the rattle as a kind of social warning signal. "Oi, I'm coming over there with terrible night vision and a quarterstaff, so you'd better stop whatever unlicensed activity you're up to." Now, a quarterstaff may sound impressive. It was certainly long enough to poke around suspicious shadows without getting too close, which is helpful because night watchmen were not necessarily hired for their physical prowess. In fact, many were older tradesmen who had already worked a full day and then received the honored duty of staying up all night defending the town from petty thieves, rebellious pigs, and the occasional inebriated merchant arguing with a milk cart. Not exactly the Avengers, bless them. Imagine yourself wrapped tightly in a wool cloak, standing at your designated corner near the butcher's row. You are holding a rattle in one hand and a lantern in the other, which, let's be honest, is mostly good for allowing burglars to see you first. The rattle shifts in your palm, a little splintery perhaps, from years of enthusiastic crime announcing. You look left, nothing. You look right, just a cat. Wait, is the cat legal? You are suddenly aware that everyone is sleeping, everyone but you, and thus the rattle becomes more than just a tool. It's company. It's your voice in the void. Occasionally, you might even spin it just to reassure your own ears you still exist. Ironically, if you spun it too often, the constable would fine you for creating a public nuisance, an act which caused many night watchmen to record 0 crimes simply because they were hesitant to be noisy about it. There's also the matter of the cry. One of your sacred duties was not just walking around in the dark hoping the candles would hold, but calling out landmarks to mark the hour. Past 3 o'clock and a foggy night. 1 o'clock and all is well. 2:30 and someone's laundry is burning, possibly on purpose. The cry served as both a kind of medieval neighborhood watch alarm system and a very local podcast, updated live by one very tired man who missed his own bed loftily and intensely. Some cries were poetic, others were less so. Indeed, in some cities, rather than make your own cries, you were instructed to memorize a list of approved chants, like a Gregorian Yelp review of the weather. This might include a decent rhyme or two, because what's civil security without an attempt at couplets? A London cry from 1641, lovingly recorded, went, 3 3/4 and a fair morning. The moon doth shine bright, and the stars give a warning. Which is charming, if entirely unhelpful during a mugging. Night watchmen were expected to master these chants. The rattle were the timing of the lantern oil, and the quiet existential panic that came from being the only person awake in a society that preferred its streets dark and its cheese unregulated. But even the most diligent night walker, rattle in hand, cry echoing down cobbled alleys, knew one truth above all. There was no defense, no protocol, no instrument loud enough against the real urban terror of the 17th century. And that, naturally, was the night soil men. But that rest your mind, dear listener, is a subject we shall wade into very delicately. Next, as the moon slides higher above the rooftops, casting silvery light on the warped eaves and crooked chimneys of the city, we find ourselves trailing behind a rather disgruntled night watchman who is, at this late hour, utterly perplexed by an adversary more cunning than any cutpurse. Wind. Yes, wind. Not some grand seafaring gale or a Shakespearean tempest, but the perfectly ordinary, slightly mischievous sort that prowls around corners and plays tricks on the unprepared. That wind. And tonight, it has chosen our dear Watchman as its chosen victim. You see, in the 17th century, before gaslights warmed street corners and electric bulbs banished darkness with the flick of a switch, the primary adversary of the night, besides drunken poets, dishonest cats, and contagious yawning, was truly the wind. It huffed out lanterns, howled through alleyways, and stirred all manner of unsettling creaks from the wooden world. And here is the problem. Our watchman's lantern, like many at the time, is a primitive cousin to a modern flashlight. It's nothing more than a tin box with slits on the side and a candle huddled shivering inside. One good gust, a puckish puff, and poof, darkness again. More than once, he stops under an awning to relight his candle, shielding it carefully with a hand as though delicately warming the last slice of roasted onion. Matchsticks, by the way, are over a century away. No handy striker strip here. He must coax a spark from flint, steel, and the kind of humble patience no modern person has had since waiting for dial-up internet. Once the lantern flickers back to life, our night watchman trudges on, his breath visible in the cold air, his boot squishing softly in whatever suspicious squelch now coats the cobblestones. The wind, naturally, waits until he's turned the last corner and then, whoosh, darkness again. This nightly battle between man and elemental mischief wasn't just inconvenient, it was dangerous. Without light, Watchmen couldn't see the signs of trouble. A cellar door left open, a group of young apprentices making bold with cider, or, worse still, filthy parchment nailed to a tavern wall advertising something so scandalous, so immoral, so positively French, that the mere sight of it might scandalize the entire parish. The city's authorities, sniffing opportunity rather than soot, eventually decided to combat this candle conundrum by outlawing wind. Well, not quite. But they did try to ban open flames after a certain hour, which, when you think about it, neatly contradicts the fact that all night watchmen walked around with open flames strapped to their belts. Civic logic in the 1600s, dear listener, was often governed by the principle of let's write this down and hope no one ever reads it. Thus, our shivering hero was obligated to keep moving, keep patrolling, and keep relighting that stubborn candle while muttering threats at the wind. And as he walks his beat from crumbling bridge to crooked lane, each flicker of his lantern casts long shadows against the city's walls, shadows of carts crammed with straw, of half-frozen dogs nosing about in the refuse, of lovers parting under windows without curtains. There's a kind of quiet beauty in his journey, the kind that's easily missed unless you're, say, floating 7 inches above the street in a late-night storytime trance. With every hour, the air grows colder. The wind picks up again, whispering secrets through shutter cracks and chimney pots. Somewhere behind him, a rooster mistakes the moon for morning and promptly regrets it. The night is long, and the candle is short, and our poor watchman is beginning to wonder whether dawn is just a rumor started by rich people. Still, he persists. Because in an age without clocks on every wall and screens in every pocket, He is the night's only proof that time ticks ever onward. He is the city's heartbeat, faint and flickering. And as the candle's glow spreads around him once more, however briefly, it leads not just the way forward, but the way inward, to a time when darkness held its own kind of ceremony, and not everyone had the privilege of sleeping through it. Now, if you're feeling cozy, and perhaps just a little flickery yourself, you might want to stay nestled there while we follow our ever-patient watchman just a few more steps into the night, where a new kind of disturbance awaits, one far less windy and far more musical. If sleep had a sound, it might be the creak of a leather boot on damp cobblestone, the soft jangle of an overworked watchman's sword hilt, and the distant lonesome clang of a muffled bell tower. Not quite mournful, but certainly not hurrying to cheer anyone up. These were the night melodies of the 17th century city, and perhaps no one heard them more intimately than the watchman, teeth chattering in the near-frozen air, trying to stay awake through what felt like an exceptionally long midnight. By this hour, most of the city had gone to bed, safely nestled under lumpy feather mattresses and behind doors bolted with enough wood and iron to withstand a miniature war. But the watchman, still pacing, still peering, still pretending not to be afraid of shadows that looked suspiciously like phantoms, highwaymen, or worse. A chicken that had escaped its coop and was now wandering the lanes like it owned the place. Now, let's talk about light, or rather, the sheer desperate lack of it. The modern world, flooded as it is with streetlights and blinking advertisements and devices that never sleep, gives the illusion that night is tame. But in the 17th century, night was a creature unto itself, dense, sneaky, and so dark you could trip over your own feet and apologize to a tree stump. Most cities had little in the way of lanterns in the streets, a few flickering oil lamps here and there, sponsored generously by either the local crown, or more likely, some brewer hoping customers could still find the tavern entrance after sunset. If you were especially lucky, a wealthy resident might hang a candle lantern outside their home, mostly for their own benefit, though it did help keep traveling cats from forming a union and declaring the entire city their domain. The official watchman, of course, carried a lantern of his own. But, and this is important, those lanterns weren't exactly high performance. Think less glorious beacon of safety in the night, and more glowworm in a shoebox. Powered by tallow, animal fat essentially, it produced a smell somewhere between roasted candle and regret, and the light, dim, flickery, and full of character. Much like your Uncle Rupert after 2 ales, our officer of the night was expected to use this baleful little flame to inspect alleyways thick with shadows, doorways where trouble could fester, and the occasional inexplicable pile of something sticky. Murder, pastry accident, no time to dwell, move along. And yes, if you were truly unlucky, you might encounter the dreadful night soil thief. Let me explain. In cities of the time, human waste was often collected in buckets and stored in outdoor privies or, heaven help us, just tossed out of windows with a polite yell of "Gardyloo." This fine collection of urban aromas was then picked up by industrious fellows known as night soil men, who carted it away to do things. Let's not dwell too much on what exactly, because you're trying to relax. Anyway, where there is municipal waste, there is invariably theft. Yes, it seems some enterprising individuals decided that stealing waste, literally human excrement, was a worthwhile endeavor. Perhaps to sell as fertilizer, perhaps out of sheer mischief. Either way, it meant that our watchman's job included the rare but scandalous possibility of catching someone red-handed, or perhaps more, brown-handed. In the event of such criminal activity, the watchman might blow his horn, an ancient, cracked trumpet that sounded like a goose trying to sneeze. Not exactly fear-inducing, but if nothing else, it let people know there was trouble afoot, or at least unpleasant smells on the wind. But let's pause now and imagine what it felt like to be the watchman, alone in a sleeping city. The street's quiet now. He stops beneath a window glowing faintly from a candle left burning low. Somewhere, a dog sleeps curled beside the coals. The church clock ticks onward. Time moves slowly, like syrup poured over a cold slice of bread. And all the while the watchman listens to the wind, the silence, and perhaps the sound of something brushing against the shutters. But whether it was spirit or stray, pickpocket or poet on a midnight stroll, the hour demanded poise. And so, clenching his cloak more tightly around him, and lifting the little lantern as though it might inspire courage, he made his way toward the next corner. The night was far from over, and the strangest discoveries were still to come. If by some miracle, or perhaps poor hiring decisions, you've survived the drafty cloak, the questionable ale, and the persistent urge to nap mid-round, you'd now find yourself confronting one particularly bitter truth of 17th century night watchman life. Everyone thinks you're annoying. Not dangerous, not heroic, not useful, just plain annoying. By nightfall, as the moon lifts her pale skirts over the chimneys and rooftops of the city, your voice becomes the most unwelcome form of entertainment. Yes, you, dear watchman, are tasked with the calling of the hour. Now, before you imagine this as some ancient broadcaster's gig, announcing the time like a vintage radio DJ draped in wool and soot, allow me to explain. The hourly call wasn't a suggestion, it was law. You were expected once each hour to announce the time to the sleeping citizens, loudly, with enthusiasm, projecting into the cold void of the night, often while battling a lungful of fog and what might generously be called pre-modern allergies. 2 of the clock, and all is well, you would croak, to nobody's delight. You see, while the original intention of these calls was well-meaning, reassuring the good people that their homes were not aflame and their pigs not yet pilfered, it quickly became more of a nighttime nuisance than a safety measure. Imagine trying to sleep in your wooden bed shared with 3 generations, a goose and a chamber pot, only to be roused hourly by Reginald the watchman shouting to the heavens, because naturally, the louder your voice, the more moral you appeared. A booming tone implied diligence, honesty, and general watchfulness, whether or not you had actually spotted anything amiss. Volume, it seems, was mistaken for virtue. This did not amuse insomnia-prone citizens. Windows were slammed, chamber pots were threatened. In one famous anecdote from Norwich, a local tailor flung his own boot squarely at the head of the night watchman, yelling, "If all is well, stop reminding me." The watchman, to his credit, paused only to return the boot later, with a passive-aggressive note implying it needed a new sole. Over time, some watchmen developed a certain flair, a musicality. In York, there were reports of watchmen breaking into little jingles. 3 of the clock, no fire nor foe, just your local watchman singing nice and low. It was not, strictly speaking, low. Dogs howled appreciatively, babies less so. The members of the wealthier class, meanwhile, wished they could pay extra for silence. Nightcaps tugged over ears did little to muffle the sonic offense. But to question the nighttime calls was to question safety itself. And in a century where fires did not come with fire engines and burglars rarely left calling cards, few were bold enough to suggest that the watchman shut his mouth. Of course, some didn't need to be told. There were watchmen, not many, mind you, but a precious few, who simply did not possess the volume necessary for nightly oration. Shy types, the soft-spoken, those with voices best described as polite whispers. These men tried, they really did, but their hour calls were often mistaken for the wind, or rats, or the last sigh of a municipal ghost. One such man in Lincoln reportedly squeaked out his nightly report with such tremulous humility that locals assumed, quite reasonably, that he was being haunted. A witch scare nearly ensued. But for those who could shout with the lungs of a town crier and the dramatic sensibilities of a tipsy actor, it was a moment of glory. For that one exhale of civic grandeur, they were not merely the man who helped carry the drunk merchant home or chased a suspicious cat out of the bakery. They were the city's voice at night, the heartbeat of the midnight hour, even if nobody wanted to hear it. And so you, weary listener, bundled in your imagined woolen cloak, lantern in one hand and a high-pitched echo in the other, understand just a little more why the pillow was regarded with such longing. Because no matter how noble or necessary your circuit may be, it was rarely thanked and usually cursed. As the clock ticks on through those sleepless 17th century hours, let's follow you now past darkened bakeries and shuttered alehouses toward what might be the most thankless, smelliest, and yet somehow most prestigious part of the whole job: sewage detection. Yes, dear listener, with the wind shifting and your boots still damp, you're about to become an amateur nose detective. But that fragrant tale awaits on the next quiet stretch of night, as the stars drape themselves lazily above the crooked rooftops, and the scent of yesterday's fishmonger's wares clung faithfully to the cobblestones. The life of a 17th century night watchman entered one of its more aromatic chapters: fire watching. Ah yes, fire. The ever-present, entirely too enthusiastic element that made wooden cities such a delightfully combustible place to live and an even more stressful place to guard. Now, if the idea of strolling through narrow, timber-framed alleys by moonlight sounds romantic, I invite you to add the ever-present anxiety that one unattended candle or a wayward spark from a domestic hearth might ignite your entire neighborhood faster than gossip leaves a parish picnic. You see, the 1600s were essentially one long, slow-burning invitation for disaster. Everyone smoked, pipes mostly, and almost always indoors. Lanterns were made of thin horn windows and wishful thinking. Chimneys often functioned more like decorative hopes than reliable heat ducts. And let's not forget the ever-charming practice of throwing hot ashes onto thatch roofs because it was convenient. In this nightly tinderbox, the watchman's job reflected both the trust the town had in his vigilance and their utter refusal to give up candles after sunset. His tools: a lantern, mostly fire; a wooden rattle, absolutely useless against flames; a polearm, a bit dramatic, but fashionable; and occasionally a bucket, which was about as symbolic as it was practical. To prevent fires, the watchman's routine involved methodical pacing past rows of houses, issuing stern announcements like, "Put out your lights," a phrase delivered with the precise energy of a man who understood flame physics entirely in the abstract. If the watchman smelt smoke that wasn't attached to a properly sleeping fireplace, he sprang, or waddled, into action. But here's the cozy historical twist. The fire-preventing part wasn't even the most stressful bit. No, it was the social politics of candle enforcement. Imagine knocking on a door past midnight. Beneath a rickety wooden sign depicting what is technically a dolphin, but looks more like a weasel with a fin, and accusing the innkeeper of burning tallow too late into the night. Not only would this interrupt the card game hosted in the back room with guests of highly flexible moral character, but it also guaranteed the Watchman a mouthful of insults and, if unlucky, a flying tankard. Still, fires did break out, spectacularly so. Entire neighborhoods could vanish overnight, their charred remains providing ample opportunity for rats to move to the suburbs. In many towns, the ringing of church bells was the alarm system of choice, and if the Watchman didn't sound the alert in time, well, let's just say his next career move was likely to involve being pelted with turnips. As crude as those warnings and responses were, they worked, sort of. By worked, I mean things didn't always burn down simultaneously. For example, after the Great Fire of London in 1666, which demolished most of the city in a fiery tantrum spread by wind and wooden construction, watchmen across Europe started taking their fire-watching duties a bit more seriously. Some cities even issued night jackets lined with vinegar-soaked linen to resist flames, which, while perhaps useless against actual fire, did make you smell like a walking salad and very hard to sneak up on. But on those quieter nights, when owls blinked from chimney tops and the streets sighed with the breath of a sleeping city, the watchman's steps settled into a familiar rhythm. He would pause before particularly fire-prone spots, the bakeries, the taverns, the homes of folks who strongly believed curtains should billow near open flames, and listen, just listen. In those moments, he wasn't just a guardian against flames. He was the custodian of calm, the nocturnal diplomat between hearth and chaos. And while he may not have inspired poetry or songs, in fact, he was more likely to inspire muffled curses from bedroom windows, his lamp carried more than oil. It carried a promise that while the city dreamed, someone was out there watching the windows, whispering to the dark, "Not tonight, fire, not tonight." And with the embers of that thought still warming our thoughts, we'll let the flames die down, just a little, as we draw the lanterns closer and move on into the softer shadows waiting ahead. The night air, thick with dew and questionable pipe smoke, draped itself lazily over the crooked rooftops of the 17th century city. Somewhere in the distance, a rooster, deeply confused about time and place, announced midnight with the confidence of a peasant who once overheard a dinner table conversation about clocks. As our unfortunate night watchman finished his sixth yawn in the span of 2 minutes, he trudged past a row of houses built before someone invented the idea of straight lines. Each building leaned on the next like a drunk nobleman at a garden party, and beneath their gabled eaves, a suspicious number of cats plotted minor rebellions. Now, it's important to understand that city lighting in the 1600s was best described as ambitious, but mostly theoretical. A few enterprising citizens had affixed weak oil lamps to their doors. Better than nothing, certainly, but often more encouraging to moths than deterring to burglars. The watchman carried his own lantern, a boxy tin contraption with more soot than sense, its flickering flame bravely pretending it illuminated more than 2 feet of cobblestone. In theory, he was meant to look out for arson, crime, and suspicious behavior. Though what counted as suspicious was a bit murky. Was that shadow a prowler, or just a hat hanging oddly? Was that a secret meeting among conspirators, or a very emotional discussion about turnip prices? And if you called the local constable about either, which would he consider worth getting out of bed for? Spoiler, neither, not even close. And then, above the sleepy rhythm of his boots echoing through the silent square, a sound, a low, rhythmic clattering. The night watchman froze, every sense tensed, Well, the three that weren't dulled by boredom and broth. Out from the alley stumbled a man pushing a makeshift cart, a squeaky contraption covered in what looked suspiciously like church candlesticks and ale mugs. Ah, a recycler, which, in the 17th century, was also known as an enthusiastic thief with a strong back. Our watchman stared, and the man stared back, and they both shared the universal look of two people who sincerely wished someone else would handle this situation. The cartman flashed a toothy grin that could either inspire confidence or a decent dental pamphlet, and nodded as if to say, "Let's pretend you didn't see me liberating these items from their proper homes." The watchman sighed, not out of approval nor even fear, but the exasperated sigh of a man who had exactly 0 forms to file and even fewer resources for pursuing justice when your only backup is a bell tied to your belt. Ah yes, the bell. The symbol of watchman authority, a small brass thing he could ring to raise the alarm, though if rung too often, it had the annoying habit of waking people up, many of whom were much grumpier when disturbed than the average thief. There had been a recent incident where a plump baker had chased him several blocks with a ladle for falsely raising the bell over what turned out to be 2 hedgehogs having an extremely serious disagreement. So the watchman simply nodded back. The recycler shuffled on, humming a tune that may or may not have been about cutlery. Crisis diplomatically averted, he resumed his rounds, checking doors to ensure they were bolted, and occasionally pausing to gently poke a suspicious-looking puddle, just to be sure it wasn't someone passed out from ale and misfortune. A surprising number of them were. The hours dragged on. Clouds shifted like heavy drapery across the moon, hiding and revealing the world in uneasy patterns. Somewhere, a dog barked once, then thought better of it. The sweet, musky notes of someone's chamber pot made their nightly descent into the street with a wet spluck. And through it all, the watchman patrolled, alone, tired, his mind wandering to warm ideas of soup and a future where people invent shoes that don't blister after 3 hours. When his feet finally carried him back toward his assigned post at the town gates, he found himself wishing for one small miracle, that in the coming hour, not a single pig would escape its pen. A wistful thought, perhaps. But in the next hush of the night, a distant squeal pierced the air, the kind that could only mean one thing. But that, dear sleepy listener, is a tale best tiptoed into next, somewhere in the shapeless blackness of pre-electricity night, beneath the confused starlight of a soot-stained city sky. You, the hypothetical 17th century night watchman, perch on a rickety wooden stool, trying very hard not to drift into unconsciousness, except your body has formed a sincere romantic attachment to the idea of sleep, and your eyes are staging a slow-motion walkout. Tonight, you are stationed at the Eastern Gate, an honourable yet deeply unpopular post. It smells of boiled cabbage, dried fish, and the unmistakable odour of damp wool that's recently been startled by the rain. Somewhere in the inky distance, a dog is barking at either a ghost, a vagrant, or the concept of mortality itself. It's hard to tell. You lean against a crooked timber beam and clutch your lantern, which is more shadow than light. The flame inside is trembling like it knows something you don't. And it's begun to rain. Not an assertive storm, just the kind of vague drizzle that makes everything feel slightly disappointed. The sort of rain that townsfolk describe as merciful in crop season and miserable the rest of the year. You're wrapped in a felted cloak that was already ancient when you inherited it, lumpy with age and stubbornly resistant to warmth. Beneath it, Your doublet scratches like an apologetic porcupine, rubbed raw by time and lack of laundering. You haven't changed clothes in 3 shifts. The city's uniforms were designed more for looking municipal than feeling comforted. Now, let us speak candidly about the real nemesis of the 17th century night watchman. Not footpads, nor fires, nor spectral nuns, but bureaucracy. You see, every transgression, racket, explosion, or suspicious shadow encountered in the dead of night had to be recorded the following morning in what was generously called the night ledger. This was a great leather-bound tome housed in a damp office, smelling robustly of mildew and pipe ash. The ink was diluted and the quills were chewed by mice or men. No one could say for sure. Inside the ledger, you were expected to script elegant recountings of what occurred on your shift, and not just heard a clatter near the blacksmith or dispersed group of loud potato sellers. No, the magistrate insisted upon flourish. So an entry might read, "At approximately the 2nd hour past midnight, I did espy a figure of unclear allegiance making his passage noisily round the cobbler's quarter, clutching what appeared to be either a goose or an unusually talkative bundle of laundry. Inquiry was made. The man proved elusive and offered no parish papers. Your penmanship was judged, your syntax frowned upon. Some city clerks, drunk on ink and power, returned your entries for improved coherence, as if legibility were even achievable by candlelight on 4 hours of sleep. And woe betide you if your shift produced no interesting incidents at all, for boredom too was suspicious. Had you truly patrolled thoroughly, or were you sneaking catnaps behind the cooper's yard? There were whispers of watchmen replaced for being insufficiently scandalous. By the 3rd month on the job, your relationship with the night ledger teeters dangerously into fiction. You begin to romanticize noises that were probably cats. You add small invented dramas. A lost glove becomes a mysterious token, a broken wheelbarrow, a scene of struggle. Nothing egregious, just enough to thread a little narrative through your weary patrol. But even lies must be artful. For once, you described a runaway pig as feral and possessed of unnatural cunning, only to be informed by the magistrate that the pig was the mayor's. Your hours were cut. Still, the ledger endures. Tonight, as you listen to the plip-plop of indifferent drizzle on your helmet, you wonder what you'll write. There's the tale of the singing chimney sweep, an old man who wanders the lanes at dawn, belting out disjointed folk songs and occasionally shouting at puddles. There's the green glow seen near the apothecary's windows, probably radium or witchcraft, or both. And of course, there's the midnight cheese heist. But that one's too good to waste on a soggy Tuesday. You sigh, stretch, and scribble a note to yourself. Create more eventful noises near richer houses. Your candle flickers lower in the lantern, the night collapsing in on itself like a tired accordion. And just as you stifle a yawn and shift for another slow march down the alley, a low whistle echoes, a tune you don't recognize, but one that makes the hairs on your neck lean in as if to listen. Somewhere, the quiet and the unknown are conspiring again. You straighten, pull your cloak close, and ready your lantern to follow the sound. Into what waits next. The wind off the Thames had turned properly villainous by midnight, slinking between roof slates and chimney pots like a pickpocket working a festival crowd. The gables groaned, lanterns flickered, and somewhere in the distance, a dog barked with the sort of determination that suggests he'd read the night's watch schedule and decided his solo contribution would suffice. Now, in theory, the night watchman was meant to maintain a calm oversight over his assigned district. A 20-block loop, if you were lucky. less of a loop and more of a Tolkien-esque journey if you weren't. But tonight, you, our brave and slightly frost-nipped night watch recruit, were stationed near a place lovingly referred to on both maps and legal writs as Fetter Lane. Ah, Fetter Lane. Not named for any fettering qualities, though after your third chase of a phantom chimney thief, you might have disagreed. More likely, it was a corruption of Fater, the old word for a marshy place, which it certainly still was when it rained, and when it didn't, it smelled like it was deciding whether to become marsh again out of sheer spite. You stood stoically, clutching your halberd in one hand and your lantern in the other, when you became aware of a sound that had become dangerously familiar, the gentle, melodic clink of boot buckles moving at an unnecessarily cautious pace. Someone was attempting stealth, badly. You squinted down the cobbled length of Turnmill Street, heart thwacking with the rhythm of anticipation and mild indigestion from that questionable mutton stew you'd gulped earlier. Your lantern cast a warm orange blot against fog-drenched stones, and there, caught in the halo, a hunched figure paused, startled possum-like, and then darted away in a blur of cloaks and suspicious guilt. You gave chase, of course. That was what the handbook said to do. Pursue all persons acting in suspicious or unruly fashion, unless armed, unreasonable, or wet. You weren't sure if this one was armed, but you could personally confirm that they appeared both unreasonable and vaguely damp. But, duty called. Your boots hit the cobblestones with a rhythm that could have passed for amateur poetry. Thump thump, clink tap, muttered swearing, repeated ad infinitum. Around the corner, past a baker's shuttered stall, through the puddle that had ambitions of becoming a moat. And just as you were closing in, the figure stopped, wheeled about, and in one impressively fluid motion, dropped a basket. There was a great clatter, a squawk, and then poultry, everywhere. As it turns out, your felonious foe was nothing more than a poultry smuggler. An oddly aggressive one, admittedly, and with an attitude that suggested he hadn't quite decided which side of the law he preferred. But yes, smuggling chickens past curfew was a common nighttime crime, and every hen was a potential profit when a trussed bird fetched an entire shilling in some parts. With the grace of a three-legged ballerina, you attempted to corral the chickens. One flew directly into your lantern, extinguishing it with the kind of performative drama usually reserved for Shakespearean widows. Another made straight for your cloak and tangled itself in your belt, pecking indignantly at your pouch of dried peas. Truly, your dignity had vacated the premises. Eventually, you managed to secure both smugglers, feathery and not. You used your halberd shaft to gently guide them toward the watch house, where you'd soon discover the protocol for arresting persons in possession of unlawful livestock involved more paperwork than you thought physically possible. But paperwork was tomorrow's concern. For now, the hardest part of your shift still lay ahead, staying awake. You settled back into position near the iron gate of Barnard's Inn, shivering despite 3 layers of wool and a hat that had long ago lost whatever respect it had for fashion. You leaned against the wall behind you, lantern relit with some effort, and the halberd resting elegantly against your shoulder, like a sleepy sentry's overcompensation. The fog thickened steadily, layering the city in a cushioned silence. Somewhere, a church bell tolled too, the sort of slow, yawning chime that made time feel more like syrup than hours. You let your eyelids sag, not quite sleeping, not quite waking. And just as dreams began to creep toward the corners of your thoughts like bashful rodents, A new sound tiptoed into the night. The furtive creak of an ale cart's axle where no cart ought to be. Your night wasn't over. Not yet, but it would be. Soon. And so, at last, we reach the weary ending of your shift. The lantern's oil guttering low, the stars fading into the bluish stretch of approaching dawn. You've somehow survived a night as a 17th century city watchman. Your tabard is damp, your boots squish ominously with each step, and your halberd leans on your shoulder like a burden more emotional than military. You may have imagined a glorious post at first, a man of authority, trusted to guard the sleeping townsfolk, cloak billowing in the fog, boots echoing dramatically in cobbled alleys. But in truth, your authority slips away faster than the warmth from your fingers at 3 a.m. Somewhere between your fourth encounter with a drunken cooper arguing with a goat and dodging chamber pots flung from upper windows by insomniacs who really just don't care who's below, history is less cinematic and more damp. The city awakens slowly, grudgingly, like a teenager sent to market. Windows creak open. A rooster offers a crow best described as philosophically hesitant. Wisps of chimney smoke curl into the pale air, unfurling like the sleepy breath of the town itself. It's been a long, dark night full of very little. And isn't that the point? For all the chatter about murder, thieves, and shadowy highwaymen, most nights on patrol involved a lot of nothing. Bakers sneaking out hours before sunrise, water carriers yawning wide enough to swallow fate itself, and the occasional midnight philosopher muttering about the moon's indifference to man. You mostly just paced, peered, and hoped nobody asked you to do anything terribly useful. But being a night watchman wasn't just a public service. It was often a punishment. The position rotated among able-bodied men, or fell to those who had the misfortune of owning property they'd rather keep. Sometimes it was doled out as community duty. Other times it was awarded to debtors who needed to pay their way with hours instead of coin. And so, in your muddy boots and sleep-deprived stupor, you were part of a grand civic balancing act held together by sheer ambivalence. There were tools of the trade, of course. Your halberd, for example, mostly decorative by this era, unless someone needed a gentle nudge back into their home after attempting to duel a tree. The lantern you carry wasn't as helpful as you'd hoped. It sputtered in the damp wind, lighting up your own puffing breath more than the cobbled street ahead. Still, there were quiet glories. A slice of bread stolen still warm from the bakery's back door. The stray cat, who adopted your leg for 3 alleys in a row, became offended, then abandoned you like a lover remembering a prior engagement. The way the mist turned into a stage curtain, and you, a sleep-deprived thespian, clad in mismatched socks, delivered your finest monologue to a flock of chickens who had trespassed with criminal nonchalance through a broken gate. And oh, the things you heard. Tallow candles flickering behind shutters, voices humming lullabies in 6 different keys at once. The chaos of a man attempting to reason with his own donkey, the soundtrack of a slumbering city, is less a lullaby and more of an avant-garde medieval jazz piece played entirely in snoring and regret. Eventually, you reach the watch house, a structure no bigger than a medium-sized ox, where the next poor soul yawns their way onto the street, nodding at you with the haunted eyes of a man who's already regretting everything. You hand off your lantern, your halberd, and whatever shred of dignity you manage to cling to between puddles. Shift change has occurred. Civilization endures. You may limp home, crawl into bed, and dream of anything but bells and fog again. Or maybe you'll dream of patrolling some moonlit utopia where chamber pots don't fly, alley cats offer pensions, and people thank you sincerely for your blurred, blinking service. But history never strokes your hair and tells you you're special. It just shuffles on, muddy boots and all. And so, as the sun creeps higher and the world blinks itself awake, you may close your heavy eyes, safe in the knowledge that, yes, you wouldn't have lasted a day, but in the odd, sleepy theatre of the past, that makes you just like everyone else. Now rest easy, lower your lantern, hang your halberd on the hook of dreams. The night has passed, and you, humble watchman for an hour or two of imagination, are finally off duty.